In the 9th century, the Dnieper River served as the vital artery of Eastern Europe. It was here that a vast network of Slavic, Finnic, and Baltic tribes began to coalesce. This river-state model transformed disparate settlements into hubs for global trade. Long ships laden with furs, honey, and wax journeyed from the Baltic north to the gates of Byzantium. Power was consolidated through wooden forts strategically positioned along these waterways. These structures were not just defenses, they were the command centers of a rising civilization. In the 9th century, Norse mariners known as the Varangians pushed deep into the river systems of Eastern Europe. These formidable traders and warriors sought wealth along the vital Dnieper and Volga trade corridors. Their expansion was defined by the river-state model. By securing these inland routes, they bridged the gap between the Baltic North and the riches of Byzantium. According to the primary chronicle, local Slavic and Finnic tribes, plagued by internal strife, invited the Norse prince Rurik to restore order. In 862, he established his seat in Novgorod, marking the birth of a new political dynasty. This union between the Norse warrior elite and the local population laid the foundational structure for what would eventually evolve into the Kievan Rus. In 882 AD, Oleg of Novgorod orchestrated a campaign that would alter history. He recognized that power was not just in the northern forests, but in the control of the Dnieper trade artery. Oleg moved his forces southward. Novgorod was his base, but the ultimate strategic prize lay further down the river. Kiev was positioned on high, defensible hills overlooking the Dnieper. It controlled the movement of goods between the Baltic and the wealth of Byzantium. By capturing these heights, Oleg secured the river's dominance, effectively uniting the northern and southern trade networks under a single formidable power. The power of early Rus was not anchored in stone palaces, but in the relentless motion of the prince and his warriors along the river arteries of the east. Central to this control was the Polyudi, a seasonal circuit where the prince would travel from his center to outlying tribes, collecting tribute in the form of furs, wax, and silver. This was a reciprocal, albeit coercive, arrangement. The prince provided military protection against nomadic raids and regional threats, while the tribes offered a portion of their wealth as tribute. Power was liquid, defined by the river currents and the reach of the prince's sword. At the heart of Eastern Europe's aspirations lay Constantinople, the unrivaled Second Rome. To the rulers of Kiev and Rus, this city represented the pinnacle of wealth, power, and divine authority. Prince Oleg of Kiev understood that to gain respect from the Byzantines, one had to command their attention. His fleet launched bold raids, striking directly at the empire's coastal defenses. These military actions were not merely for conquest, they were diplomatic levers. They forced the Byzantines to the negotiating table, securing crucial access for Rus merchants. Subsequent treaties granted the Rus exclusive trading rights. Ships flowed from Kiev to the Black Sea, bringing back silk, spices, and gold, which fueled the rapid growth of the Kievan state. This unprecedented influx of wealth transformed Kiev from a remote trade hub into a sophisticated European power, deeply integrated into the Byzantine political and economic orbit. While Olga of Kiev consolidated the realm through diplomacy and administrative reform, her son Sviatoslav chose a different path. He was a prince defined not by the throne, but by the sword. Sviatoslav's most decisive campaign was the destruction of the Khazar Khaganate. This shattered the dominant power on the southern steppe, clearing the path for the Rus to command the trade corridors of the Don and Volga rivers. By breaking the Khazar stranglehold, Sviatoslav dramatically expanded the borders of the Rus state, transforming it from a fragmented confederation into an ambitious, outward-looking military power. In the late 10th century, Vladimir the Great stood at a crossroad. Ruling over a sprawling, fragmented collection of Slavic lands, he sought a unifying spiritual identity to anchor his growing empire. His gaze turned toward Byzantium. Beyond just faith, adopting Eastern Orthodox Christianity promised access to the Mediterranean's sophisticated culture, trade networks, and imperial legitimacy. This was more than a religious conversion, it was a civilizational shift. The Rus integrated the aesthetics, law, and administrative structures of the Byzantine Empire. In 988, the mass baptism in the Dnieper River marked the birth of a new Rus. A unified cultural identity began to crystallize, setting the foundation for the centuries to come. The baptism of Kievan Rus was not merely a spiritual conversion. It served as a massive cultural catalyst, integrating a disparate network of tribes into the sophisticated administrative and intellectual framework of the Byzantine world. Christianity brought the Cyrillic script. This allowed the state to move beyond oral tradition, establishing written laws and a centralized administrative bureaucracy that linked the scattered principalities. Stone architecture and the iconographic tradition redefined the landscape. These cathedrals were not just places of worship, they were visual manifestos of imperial power and divine order. Ultimately, the church became the administrative backbone of the state. It transformed local tribal identities into a unified consciousness, anchoring Kievan Rus within the cultural gravity of the Christian world. The cultural synthesis of the late 10th century created a distinct East Slavic civilization, one that would survive the fragmentation of the state and define its trajectory for centuries to come. Under the rule of Yaroslav the Wise, the Kievan Rus experienced a remarkable golden age, cementing its status as a sophisticated and powerful state. Yaroslav expanded the influence of Kiev, consolidating power across vast territories from the Baltic to the Caspian. He commissioned the construction of the St. Sophia Cathedral, a monumental testament to the city's spiritual and architectural aspirations. Yaroslav also established the Ruskaya Pravda, a comprehensive legal code that provided structure and justice across his domains. His daughters' marriages into royal houses across Europe positioned the Kievan Rus as an equal player among the great powers of the medieval world. Yaroslav's vision left a lasting mark on history, bridging Eastern and Western traditions to forge a uniquely resilient and cultured state. Following the death of Yaroslav the Wise, the fragile unity of Kievan Rus began to dissolve. The established seniority system, meant to preserve order, instead ignited endless competition among his heirs. Central authority withered as princes prioritized local dominance over collective stability. The once unified state fractured into semi-independent principalities, each vying for influence. Regional power centers such as Novgorod in the north, Vladimir Suzdal in the east, and Galicia-Volhynia in the west emerged as distinct political actors. This shift marked the end of an era, paving the way for a more localized yet volatile history of Eastern Europe. As Kiev grew vulnerable to the pressures of the southern steppe, the center of political gravity shifted to the dense, protective forests of the northeast. This shift laid the groundwork for a new, more centralized form of Russian statehood. The social and political structure here diverged sharply from the southern tradition. While Kiev remained trapped in seniority-based disputes, Vladimir Suzdal cultivated a more focused, centralized authority. Prince Andrei Bogolyubsky emerged as the architect of this new order. He moved the political focus away from Kiev, effectively challenging its historical primacy and establishing his own seat as the true heart of the land. This centralization was reflected in the cultural landscape, where the construction of grand, white stone cathedrals served to cement the prestige of these emerging northern centers. By intertwining religious authority with the state, the rulers of Vladimir Suzdal established a model of autocratic power that would define the centuries to follow. By the mid-12th century, Kiev stood as the crown jewel of the Rus principalities. But beneath its golden domes, a transformation was already underway. Prince Andrei Bogolyubsky of Vladimir viewed Kiev not as a mother, but as a rival. He sought to shift the center of gravity to the north. In 1169, Andrei's forces breached the city walls. What followed was a brutal sacking, unheard of between Christian Rus princes. Kiev was burned, its churches looted, and its status as the undisputed center of the Rus world was shattered. The fall of Kiev paved the way for a fragmented Russia, where competing principalities would rise from the ashes, eventually leading to the ascendancy of Moscow. The Mongol storm first appeared on the horizon of the Russian principalities in 1223. At the Kalka River, a coalition of Kievan princes faced a Mongol reconnaissance force, only to be crushed by superior tactical mobility and discipline. The Mongols revolutionized warfare through their horse archers. They moved with a speed that defied the defensive logic of medieval fortifications and heavy infantry. In 1237, the reconnaissance ended. Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis, launched a massive coordinated invasion. Winter, once a deterrent, became an icy highway for the Mongol hordes. City after city fell as the Mongol storm swept through the forested north. This campaign fundamentally reorganized the region, shifting power away from the Dnieper and forcing the fractured principalities to adapt to a new, harsh reality under the Golden Horde. By 1240, the Mongol Tumen descended upon the Dnieper. The era of the Kievan Rus was reaching a violent, irreversible conclusion. For weeks, the stone walls of Kiev withstood the onslaught, but the siege engines and fire arrows proved relentless. The southern heart of the Rus fell in fire and ruin. With the political order shattered and the southern steppes under occupation, the survivors sought refuge in the deep northern forests, away from the path of the Mongol horsemen. Following the Mongol conquest, the political reality of the Rus principalities underwent a traumatic transformation. The once sovereign princes were reduced to vassals of the Golden Horde, forced to navigate a precarious tributary existence. At the heart of this new order was the Yarlik, or patent to rule. Princes were now required to travel hundreds of miles to the Khan's court at Sarai to secure their right to govern. This journey was fraught with danger and humiliation. The Khan held absolute authority over who would reign, and any sign of insubordination could lead to the prince's execution or the total destruction of his city. The courtly interactions between the Rus nobility and the Mongol elite were strictly choreographed. It was a stark shift from the former independence of the Kievan era. Now, survival depended on the grace of the Khan. Beyond political subservience, the Rus lands were systematically drained of resources. Heavy taxes and forced military support were the price for avoiding total eradication, shifting the focus of the princes from territorial glory to simple, brutal survival. This era of vassalage redefined the Russian political identity, centralizing authority under the heavy hand of the horde and creating a governance model defined by absolute autocracy and necessity. While Kiev lay in ruins under the Mongol yoke, the Republic of Novgorod stood as a resilient bastion of the north. Sheltered by dense forests and marshes, this merchant city-state maintained its independence, guided by the strategic brilliance of Prince Alexander Nevsky. Alexander Nevsky faced an impossible geopolitical dilemma. To the east, he skillfully navigated the crushing pressure of the Golden Horde, choosing pragmatism over certain destruction. Yet to the west, he prepared for war against encroaching Crusader knights. The Teutonic Knights and the Livonian Order sought to convert the East to Roman Catholicism by force. Nevsky recognized this as an existential threat not just to land, but to the orthodox soul of the Rus people. The climax came in 1242, on the frozen surface of Lake Peipus. Nevsky's forces outmaneuvered the heavy cavalry of the Crusaders, exploiting the fragile ice to shatter their formation. This victory, known as the Battle on the Ice, halted the Northern Crusade. The Crusaders were well-equipped, representing the zenith of Western military technology. However, Nevsky's understanding of terrain and the endurance of his infantry secured the future of the northern principalities. By securing his western border, Novgorod remained a vital link between the Rus lands and Europe. Under Nevsky, the survival of the Republic provided a necessary continuity for the culture and administration that would eventually define the future Russian state. In the shadowed forests of the 13th century, Moscow began not as an empire, but as an unremarkable, quiet outpost. Hidden from the violent turbulence of the steppes, it was a place easily ignored. Moscow's geography was its greatest shield. While the southern principalities were decimated by nomadic incursions, Moscow flourished in the deep woodlands, securing control over critical river junctions that linked northern trade routes. The princes of Moscow adopted a policy of extreme pragmatism. By acting as the loyal tax collectors for the Mongol horde, they maintained domestic stability, consolidated power, and diverted wealth into their own coffers. This accumulation of resources fueled the growth of the city, transforming a simple wooden settlement into a rising center of religious and political influence that would one day challenge the very masters it served. In the shadow of the Mongol yoke, the Principality of Moscow remained a minor power. However, Prince Ivan, later known as Khalida or Moneybag, orchestrated a radical shift in fortunes. Khalida's brilliance lay in his pragmatic submission. By assuming the role of the primary tax collector for the Golden Horde, he not only pacified the Khan, but used the position to centralize wealth and suppress rival principalities. Equally significant was his alliance with the Church. By persuading the Metropolitan to relocate the seat of spiritual power from Vladimir to Moscow, Khalida secured a prestige that no other prince could claim. This relocation granted Moscow Third Rome moral legitimacy. It transformed the city from a mere administrative outpost into the protector of the Orthodox faith, setting the stage for future autocratic dominance. Through the marriage of material wealth and divine authority, Ivan Khalida provided the blueprint for the rise of the Muscovite state. For over a century, the Russian principalities lived under the shadow of the Golden Horde. The tribute system was relentless, a crushing weight on the soul of a fragmented people. By 1380, the tide began to turn. Prince Dmitry of Moscow dared to defy the Khan's general, Mamai. He rallied the disparate princes, forging a coalition that prioritized survival over subservience. On the plains of Kulikovo, the Russian forces met the Golden Horde in a clash of titans. It was not just a battle for territory, but a desperate fight to shatter the myth of the Horde's eternal invincibility. Though the tribute system would linger for decades, the psychological chains were broken. Kulikovo demonstrated that the Horde could be defeated, forever altering the trajectory of the Russian state. By 1480, the authority of the Golden Horde had waned, but the tradition of tribute remained a heavy shadow over Moscow. Ivan III, known as Ivan the Great, stood at a turning point in history. At the Ugra River, Ivan's forces faced the army of Akhmat Khan. Rather than an open slaughter, the two sides maintained a tense, cold standoff for weeks, signaling the changing tides of power. As winter approached, Akhmat Khan retreated. This bloodless victory effectively ended the Mongol yoke that had burdened the Russian lands for over 2 centuries, confirming Moscow as a sovereign power. To solidify his imperial status, Ivan wed Sophia Palaiologina, a Byzantine princess. This union tied Moscow to the grandeur of Constantinople, fueling the narrative of Moscow as the Third Rome. With the Mongol threat neutralized and his dynasty bolstered by imperial lineage, Ivan the Great transformed a fragmented collection of principalities into a centralized, burgeoning state. The journey from decentralized river trade routes to a unified empire was a process of centuries. By the mid-16th century, the Rurikid dynasty had consolidated the scattered principalities into a centralized force. At the helm stood Ivan IV, later known as the Terrible. His reign marked the transition from a prince among peers to an absolute autocrat. In 1547, the coronation ceremony within the Kremlin transformed the ruler. No longer a grand prince, he was now the Tsar of Russia, a title derived from Caesar, signifying a sacred and imperial authority. This new tsardom defined itself as the Third Rome, the final defender of Eastern Orthodoxy. Projects like St. Basil's Cathedral were testament to this newfound ambition. The evolution of Russia was forged in the fires of Mongol occupation and refined in the halls of the Kremlin. The tsardom was born, setting the stage for the centuries of imperial history that followed.